September 13th, 1943, Salerno Beach, Italy. Captain Charles Schunstrom watches his artillery forward observer die in real time. The lieutenant is pinned 30 yards ahead behind a low stone wall. A German MG-42 machine gun, invisible in a farmhouse window, stitches the ground around him with dirt and rock chips. The soldier is screaming coordinates into his SCR-536 handy-talkie, his voice raw with static and panic. He's trying to call fire on the nest that's decimating Charlie Company. At the artillery battalion 1 mile inland, the radio operator hears only a maddening constant hiss. The lieutenant stands for a split second, desperate for a clear signal. The MG-42 burst catches him in the chest. The frantic waving of the radio's 3-foot antenna stops abruptly. In the next 20 minutes, Schunstrom's company takes 47 casualties. Men bleed out in the Italian sand, their deaths preventable by a single unimpeded artillery strike. This isn't bad luck, it's a predictable failure. The U.S. Army is fighting with a radio shackled by its own technical specifications, a device failing across every beachhead and hedgerow in Europe. The problem is not the courage of the men or a flaw in manufacturing. The problem is physics, mandated by a 1940 contract. The SCR-536 operates on frequencies between 3 to 6 MHz using amplitude modulation, AM. This low frequency band is awash with the noise of war, engine ignition, lightning, the crackle of 1,000 other radios. The AM signal, like a wary shout in a storm, is overwhelmed. Worse, to efficiently transmit power on these low frequencies, the antenna needs to be impossibly long. The SCR-536's 1-meter whip is a brutal compromise. Most of the transmitter's energy is lost as heat before it even becomes a radio wave. The promised 1-mile range collapses to 300 yards in combat, a distance a machine gunner measures in milliseconds. Captain Schunstrom, a veteran of North Africa, knows this intimately. He has come to expect radio silence when he needs fire support the most. He watches his men die not from a lack of artillery, but from a failure of connection. What he doesn't know is that miles away, a court-martial offense is being committed in a Chicago workshop. An engineer, ordered to build a better AM radio, has secretly thrown the Army's rulebook into the trash. He isn't just improving the radio, he's changing the very frequency that binds it, and in doing so, he's rewriting the rules of survival for the American infantrymen.
The failure at Salerno was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was a doctrine paralyzed by convention. In 1940, the U.S. Army Signal Corps, tasked with equipping the force, faced a simple, urgent need: a portable radio for infantry platoons. Their solution was to order what they knew. The contract to Galvin Manufacturing specified a 5-pound handheld transceiver using amplitude modulation, AM, in the 3 to 6 MHz band. It was the safe choice. AM was the standard for commercial broadcasting and existing military sets. It was reliable in a quiet field, but war is not quiet. On the chaotic electromagnetic battlefield of 3 MHz, the AM signal from an SCR-536 was drowned by a tsunami of natural and man-made noise. More critically, the physics were against it. A 6-foot antenna, the maximum a soldier could reasonably carry, is wildly inefficient at such low frequencies. It was like trying to push an ocean liner with a canoe paddle. Most of the transmitter's precious battery power was wasted, dissipated as heat in the coils and capacitors, rather than radiated as a clear signal. The engineers at Galvin delivered exactly what was asked for in 1941, the SCR-536. And from its first field tests, combat officers reported back with the same furious frustration: it doesn't reach. The radio's effective world ended at the edge of a small town, where the first line of trees. Platoon leaders advancing under fire found themselves alone, their lifeline to company command and supporting arms severed by a hill, a storm, or simply by distance. By 1942, the tactical cost was measured in bodies and battles. After the shock of Kasserine Pass, where communication breakdowns crippled the American response, studies quantified the disaster. One report concluded 18% of tactical failures were due to radios that couldn't transmit or receive. Artillery fire missions were delayed by an average of 12 minutes, an eternity for a pinned-down rifle company. The consensus among senior Signal Corps engineers was grimly definitive. Given the technological constraints of size, weight, and power, a reliable man-portable radio with a range beyond 2 miles was a physical impossibility. Memos circulated stating that operations must be planned assuming units would be out of contact. This wasn't just a hardware problem, it was a cancer at the heart of American combined arms doctrine. The entire concept of fast, mobile warfare, tanks coordinating with infantry, forward observers directing thunderous artillery barrages, depended on a network of instant communication. Without it, the U.S. Army risked becoming as rigid and slow as the foes it sought to defeat. In Britain, Major General James E. Cheney warned Washington of the dire disparity. British forces, using heavier but more reliable radios, could communicate over miles. American boys, he implied, would pay the price in blood on European beaches. The military was staring into a technological abyss, demanding a miracle that its own experts said could not exist. Meanwhile, in a Chicago lab, a man who had never heard that memo was quietly building it. While the Army Signal Corps grappled with the limitations of 3 megahertz, a quiet revolution was brewing 800 miles away, led by a man who embodied the opposite of military orthodoxy. Daniel Edward Noble was a 39-year-old engineering instructor at the University of Connecticut, a former farm boy with a master's degree and a deep, intuitive understanding of radio waves. He was not a weapons designer or a contractor, he was a problem solver. In the 1930s, while the industry ignored it, Noble became fascinated by the work of eccentric inventor Edwin Armstrong and his frequency modulation, FM system. Where AM varied the power of a signal, easily drowned by noise, FM varied its frequency, making it inherently resistant to static. The establishment, led by RCA with billions invested in AM, dismissed FM as a complex, expensive hobbyist toy. But Noble saw its military potential with crystal clarity. In 1940, when Galvin Manufacturing, desperate for fresh ideas on their new Army backpack radio contract, contacted the university, Noble was their man. He arrived in Chicago not as a savior, but as a consultant. He examined the Army's strict specifications for the new radio, range of several miles, man-portable, using AM. He did the calculations, and he realized that to meet the Army's desperate need, he would have to defy every one of their explicit wants. The physics of AM on any frequency they'd consider would never deliver. The solution, he believed, was a leap into the radio wilderness, a backpack unit using Armstrong's FM technology in the high, experimental 40 to 48 megahertz band. The meeting in Paul Galvin's office was a moment of supreme corporate and personal risk. Noble presented his heretical design, an FM radio, not an AM one. Galvin, the founder of the company that bore his name, understood the stakes immediately. The Army's contract was their lifeline. Delivering a radio that ignored the specifications wasn't just a breach of contract, it was professional suicide that could destroy Galvin Manufacturing and land them in legal jeopardy. "Will the Army accept it?" Galvin asked. Noble's answer was blunt. "No, the specifications require AM." The silence that followed held the future of the company. Galvin was a businessman, but he was also a patriot who read the reports of communications failure as everyone else. He looked at Noble, the unassuming professor who spoke in equations and certainties, not in corporate jargon. He thought of the lieutenants like the one at Salerno, screaming into a dead microphone. In that moment, Galvin made a decision that defied all business sense. He gave Noble a small team, a secret budget, and a mandate. Build it, but do it in the shadows. The Army doesn't see it until we know it works. The project, internally dubbed Project 103, was born as an act of technological insubordination. In a locked section of the Chicago plant, Daniel Noble, the quiet heretic, began to assemble the radio the Army had forbidden him to build, betting his career and his company on a frequency the generals had never heard of. The laboratory for Project 103 was not a sterile government-funded facility. It was a locked back room in Galvin's Chicago factory, a cluttered sanctuary of heresy. Here, Daniel Noble assembled his small, devoted team, men like Henryk Magnuski, a brilliant Polish immigrant and FM specialist, and a handful of engineers who shared a belief in the possible over the prescribed. They worked under a veil of secrecy, using parts charged to other accounts, working late hours after the official AM radio project had shut down for the day. Their goal was not to incrementally improve the failing SCR 536. It was to build a radio from a new set of physical laws. The core of their design was the jump to the 40 to 48 megahertz band. At this high frequency, the 6-foot whip antenna was no longer a compromise. It was nearly optimal, allowing the transmitter to efficiently couple its power into the air as a clean, powerful signal. More importantly, this slice of the radio spectrum was a quiet frontier, far above the storm of electrical noise that plagued the 3 megahertz band. But the technology was raw. There were no off-the-shelf parts for an FM military transceiver. Every component, from the stable crystal oscillators that generated the precise frequency to the complex discriminator circuit that decoded the signal, had to be designed, tested, and hand-built from scratch. They scrounged, they improvised, and they calculated with slide rules, their workbench a chaotic jungle of vacuum tubes, hand-wound coils, and scattered schematics that would have baffled and enraged the Army inspectors just floors below. The first prototype, ready in the fall of 1940, was a Frankenstein's monster of potential. Nicknamed the Lump for its crude wooden frame housing a tangle of wires and tubes, it weighed over 40 pounds. It was ugly, expensive, and a direct violation of their contract. Its moment of truth came on a cold October day in a vacant lot south of Chicago. Noble manned one unit. Magnuski took another, got into a car, and began to drive away, his voice reporting back over the static-free air. 1 mile. 2 miles. 3. The clarity was shocking. No fade, no crackle of ignition noise, just a voice as clear as a telephone call. At 4 miles, through light industrial clutter, the signal held. At 5 miles, it began to weaken, but remained perfectly intelligible. In that moment, in the crisp autumn air, they had achieved the impossible. They had a portable radio with a reliable 5-mile range. The triumph was instantly shadowed by peril. They now possessed proof that the Army's entire approach was obsolete. The next step was not an engineering challenge, but a bureaucratic and personal minefield. They had to reveal their masterpiece to the very men whose rules they had broken, gambling their careers and Paul Galvin's company on a single audacious demonstration. Noble packed the Lump into a crate, knowing he was either about to revolutionize modern warfare or become a footnote in a court-martial proceeding. The air in the testing room at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey in November 1940 was thick with skepticism and cigar smoke. Lieutenant Colonel William S. Rumbaugh, chief of the Signal Corps radio branch, had assembled his top engineers and procurement officers. They expected a progress report on Galvin's AM backpack radio. What Daniel Noble unboxed was an affront to their expertise, a bulky, unauthorized FM transceiver operating on the forbidden 40 megahertz band. Rumbaugh's face hardened. "You violated the contract specifications," he stated, not asked. Noble, the quiet professor amidst a sea of uniforms, didn't flinch. "Yes, sir," he replied. "Would you like to see it work?" This was more than a demo. It was a trial. The military's entire investment in AM technology, its doctrine, and its institutional pride were in the dock. Noble's team set up one unit at the base. A Signal Corps lieutenant, James Peterson, took another and drove a truck down a pre-planned route into the New Jersey Pine Barrens, terrain notorious for swallowing radio signals. The officers listened, arms crossed, to the scratchy speaker. 1 mile. Peterson's voice came through with unsettling crystal-clear clarity. 2 miles. Not a hint of static. A few eyebrows raised. 3 miles, then 4. The voice remained as if he were in the next room, reporting landmarks from behind hills that should have been radio shadows. The scribbling of note-taking pencils became frantic. At 5 miles, the impossible was now undeniable in the room. The SCR-356 would have been dead for 2 miles. Noble's lump was chatting casually across 5. Colonel Rumbaugh keyed the mic. Return to base. Test concluded. He turned from the radio, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed was broken by Major Frank Stoner, a senior Signal Corps engineer. "Colonel, we can't adopt this. It's a complete violation of procurement. FM is unstable, unproven. We'd have to rewrite every manual, retrain every operator." The room erupted. One faction saw salvation, the other saw chaos and career risk. They argued about cost, logistics, the arrogance of a civilian contractor rewriting military standards. Noble stood silently, letting the performance speak for itself. Rumbaugh let the storm rage for a minute, then raised a hand. He fixed his eyes on Noble. "Mr. Noble, if enemy forces attempt to jam this frequency, what happens?" Noble responded calmly, explaining FM's inherent resistance to interference. Rumbaugh asked about production, failure rates, battery life. Each answer was precise, confident. Then Rumbaugh posed the question that silenced the room. "Gentlemen, if you were a lieutenant advancing under fire, would you rather have a radio that works 300 yards half the time or a radio that works 3 miles every time?" The hypothetical was a brutal truth. Turning to his stunned staff, Rumbaugh delivered his verdict. "Major Stoner, draft a memo to the chief signal officer. We are requesting authorization to proceed with FM development. Mr. Noble, you have unofficial approval to continue. Official channels will follow." It was an act of monumental bureaucratic courage. In that moment, Rumbaugh chose potential lives saved over strict protocol. The deadlock was broken. The heretic's radio had just been granted a pardon and a passport to war.
The SCR-300, now officially sanctioned but still a rare and secret weapon, faced its ultimate test not in Europe, but in the suffocating green hell of the Pacific. In August 1942, on Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's 2nd Marine Raider Battalion received 3 of the precious new radios. They were a curious, bulky addition to a Marine's pack, but Carlson, an innovator himself, understood their potential. The island was a radio graveyard. The dense, wet jungle canopy and jagged volcanic ridges absorbed and scattered the low-frequency AM signals of the SCR-536, reducing communications to couriers who took half an hour to deliver a message through hostile terrain. On August 23rd, near the Tenarue River, Carlson's raiders were pinned down by a network of expertly camouflaged Japanese machine gun nests. The jungle ahead was a wall of lead and foliage. Their own artillery support was miles away, separated by a maze of ridges and ravines that made line-of-sight communication a fantasy. One of Carlson's forward observers, a young Marine with the experimental SCR-300 strapped to his back, moved to a precarious vantage point. With the sharp crack of sniper fire snapping overhead, he extended the antenna and keyed the handset, his voice steady but urgent. He called a fire mission, transmitting coordinates through a landscape that had swallowed every other radio signal. He didn't know if his voice was reaching anyone or just echoing uselessly in the electronic void of the jungle. The reply was instantaneous and jarringly clear in his headset. "Roger, fire mission acknowledged, shot out." There was no static, no request to repeat. 40 seconds later, the calm voice returned. Splash. The first artillery rounds screamed in from an impossible distance, crashing with devastating precision directly onto the Japanese positions. The machine gun fire stopped abruptly, replaced by the deafening silence of shattered earth and broken machinery. The advance happened without a single casualty in the assault.
In his after-action report, Carlson didn't mince words. He wrote that the SCR-300 performed, quote, flawlessly under conditions where all previous radio equipment failed completely. This was the hard proof the Signal Corps needed. It wasn't a lab test, it was a life-saving miracle performed under fire. The report from Guadalcanal became a sacred text among communications officers. It proved that FM on the high band could do what AM could not, pierce the fog of war, both literal and electromagnetic. Production orders, once cautious, were now urgent. The walkie-talkie, as the troops began to call the SCR-300, was no longer an experiment. It was a battle-proven lifeline, and every infantry company from New Guinea to Normandy would soon be screaming for one. By D-Day, the SCR-300 was no longer a secret. It was the nervous system of the American advance. On the bloody chaos of Omaha Beach, forward observers like Captain Milton Skip Gray of the 1st Infantry Division huddled in shell craters, seawater and sand grinding against their equipment. With German 88mm shells tearing apart the landing craft behind them, Gray's mission was to call in the guns of the USS Texas 3 miles out in the channel. He keyed his SCR-300. Through the roar of explosions and machine gun fire, a clear voice from the battleship's fire control center responded. For 11 relentless hours, under constant fire and in pouring rain, Gray directed a storm of 14-inch naval shells onto the German strongpoints. The radio, drenched and battered, never failed. "That radio kept me alive," Gray would recall decades later. "It kept hundreds of men around me alive." This scene repeated itself across every front. The statistics painted a staggering picture of its impact. A U.S. Army study compared units. Those with old SCR-536s suffered 18.3% casualties per engagement, with artillery support taking an average of 12 agonizing minutes. Units equipped with the SCR-300 saw casualties drop to 11.7%, with fire support arriving in under 2 minutes. It wasn't just about speed, it was about certainty. For the first time, a company commander could order a complex flanking maneuver or a retreat under pressure and know his orders would be heard. The enemy understood this advantage all too well. Captured German officers expressed a mixture of frustration and awe. Major Hans Schmidt of the 352nd Division, which defended Omaha Beach, was blunt in his interrogation. "We couldn't stop them. Every time we positioned a weapon, their artillery destroyed it. They had observers everywhere, all communicating perfectly." German signal intelligence, upon finally capturing an SCR-300, was shocked. Their own portable radios required bulky vehicle-mounted generators or complex setups. The Americans had a tool that gave every squad leader the power to summon the fury of the entire combined arms machine. U.S. Army analysts, poring over the data after the war in studies like those from the Combat Studies Institute, arrived at a sobering conclusion. The SCR-300 and its FM technology directly saved an estimated 17,000 American lives. 17,000 fathers, sons, and brothers who came home because a radio signal cut through the static. It didn't win the war with a single shot, but it multiplied the effectiveness of every rifle, every tank, and every artillery piece. As Captain Gray put it, simply, that radio won the war. It was the unglamorous olive-drab tool that turned American tactical doctrine from a theory on paper into an unstoppable, coordinated reality on the ground. For Daniel Noble, victory brought no parade. In 1945, he received the Medal for Merit, the nation's highest civilian honor for wartime service. The citation praised his exceptionally meritorious conduct. Then he quietly returned to work. He declined interviews, shunned publicity, and when historians called, he directed them to his team at Motorola, the new name for Galvin Manufacturing. To Noble, the SCR-300 was not a monument to himself, but a problem correctly solved. He spent the rest of his career in the lab, pioneering mobile police radios and early concepts for cellular telephone networks, holding over 75 patents.
He became a vice president, a mentor, a legend within the walls of Motorola, yet remained virtually unknown outside them. When he died in 1980, his obituary in the New York Times devoted a single line to the radio that saved thousands, focusing instead on his later work. The man who had bent the rules of physics and bureaucracy to give the infantry a voice had chosen to let his work speak for him. Meanwhile, the SCR-300 itself took its place in museums, the Smithsonian, the World War II Museum, a silent artifact in a glass case, its story often reduced to a simple label, WWII walkie-talkie. But the true legacy was not in glass cases or corporate titles. It echoed in the clear signal of every police radio, every emergency responder's call for help on the 40 to 48 megahertz band he championed. It lived on in the secure, static-free tactical communications of every modern army. And most powerfully, it endured in the memories of the men he never met. Decades later, at a Motorola Museum reunion, a 94-year-old former forward observer, Colonel Robert Hannell, stood before an SCR-300. His voice broke as he spoke. "I should have died in Normandy 100 times," he said. "Every time I called, help came. Dan Noble built that radio. Dan Noble saved my life." In that moment, the full measure of the Titan's legacy was clear. It wasn't fame. It was the quiet certainty of a radio check cutting through the static of history. It was the bond between an engineer in a Chicago backroom and a young soldier in a foxhole, connected by a frequency that refused to fail. The greatest weapon he gave the Allies wasn't one that killed. It was the one that answered, every single time. "Roger, I hear you. Help is on the way."